Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, and I'm joined by Ben Kinsley, who is a co-host. And Ben is the executive director for Campaign for Vermont. And we like to let you know that our tagline is listening beyond the sound bites, an important thing to remember. A couple of weeks ago, we had Mary Moulton on the show, and Mary's the executive director for Washington County Mental Health Services. And she brought several members of her staff, and we had an amazing discussion about the crisis in mental health here in central Vermont and in Vermont. She talked about a new initiative called Team 2 and how successful it is. We've learned that whether a mental health crisis happens at the home or in public places, it's very critical that the first responders be trained in dealing with mental health issues. So tonight we are talking about Team 2, and with us is Chief Tony Facos, Chief of Police of Montpelier. And Tony, welcome. I'd shake your hand, but you're too far away. And next to Tony is Kristen Chandler, who is the Team 2 coordinator, and you're housed out of Washington County Mental Health, did I?
I am,
Okay,
yes.
Great. Maybe, why don't you start, Kristen, telling our viewers a little bit about yourself?
Sure, Pat. Well, I was an assistant attorney general for 8 years with the Department of Mental Health. And prior to that, I was the staff attorney for the Vermont State Police.
Oh.
So this was a really good fit as far as being a training coordinator to bring both mental health crisis clinicians and law enforcement together.
And how did you get to be at Washington County Mental Health? Because I know Mary Moulton, I think, played a pretty important role in the development of Team 2.
Mary did. She, and we'll talk about that, I'm sure, a little bit. But the only reason I'm literally just housed at Washington County Mental Health. I'm not an employee. I'm they're in a collaborative grant with the Department of Mental Health and the Vermont State Police.
Oh, I see.
So they agreed to give me some office space.
Oh, that's nice. Great place. Tony, do you want to talk a little bit about yourself? Not that we all don't know you from this area. But.
Sure. Yeah, I'm actually on 31 years of law enforcement, most of which is here in Montpelier. Many years ago, I was the second FBI trained hostage crisis negotiator for the city of Montpelier, along with now Captain Martel. And since then, we've always had a close relationship with Washington County Mental Health. They're basically an extension of the police department. So our culture in Montpelier has always been one of working with resources such as Washington County Mental Health to help successfully interact, support, and resolve any issues when somebody's in crisis. So it's something that's been well ingrained with us. Now we have a very robust team of crisis negotiators in Montpelier PD, and two of whom are actual instructors, trainers for the Team 2 that we're going to be talking about later today.
Oh, that's great. So I'm going to ask Kristen to do this because you've tried to help me several times in emails, but I haven't quite figured this out. We have Act 80, Act 79, all of which sort of mandated some level of training. And then we have Team 2. Could you or the chief explain all the different levels that I haven't been able to get straight yet?
Sure, absolutely. So when you call Act 80 training, it's also called interacting with persons with a mental illness. And that's the 8-hour mandated training for all law enforcement officers in Vermont. That was the result of the Woodward shooting in West Brattleboro many years ago. And once that really tragedy was looked at, it was decided that we really needed to make sure that law enforcement officers received specific training on the basics of mental health. So it started off as a 6-hour training. Act 80 is now an 8-hour training. And that's taught at the Police Academy and also out in the field by Cindy Taylor Patch, Windham County Sheriff Keith Clark, and myself.
Oh, right.
So that's an 8-hour training that is a prerequisite for people to then take Team 2 training. Act 79 was an act that came about after Irene, Tropical Storm Irene, that provided funding for mental health agencies to be able to treat people in the community as a response to not having the state hospital anymore. It was known that it was going to be really necessary to treat people in their homes and back in the community. So Department of Mental Health gave all the designated agencies sums of monies for them to be able to be mobile so that they could go to the person out in the field rather than when they previously had been treated in the hospital.
Okay, great.
So that's Act 79. And then Team 2 is what we like to consider sort of the 200 level class. If Act 80 is a 100 level class, Team 2 is a 200 level class. So it's not mandatory, it's a voluntary program, but Act 80 is a prerequisite for law enforcement officers to be able to attend.
Okay.
And Team 2 really is the brainchild of Mary Moulton, who you've mentioned already.
Yes, right.
And she knew that, as the chief just alluded to, that Washington County Mental Health had enjoyed for many, many years a great relationship with their law enforcement counterparts in Washington County. But she became aware that it wasn't the case around the state, and it really was needed that there would be some training for everybody in the state.
And
so
what's the take-up rate at this point for the Team 2 training? Is that uniformly accepted around the state and a regular practice for officers to be trained in that, or is it kind of not as universal as maybe some would hope?
Well, it's kind of a mixed bag, I'll say. So there are 5 different regions around the state where Team 2 is offered. There are a little over 70 police agencies in Vermont. Do I have that right?
Just shy of that, yeah.
Okay. So 54 police agencies have sent at least one person to the training. There are some, about 20 agencies that have never sent anybody.
Oh.
So we're really hoping that, as it's only been in existence for 3 years now, so as law enforcement officers who've been through it go back out into the field and their colleagues hear about it, I think it's sort of gaining more momentum.
And
if
are
you will.
most of those departments that haven't trained an officer, are those like smaller departments in more rural areas of the state, or are they sometimes in larger cities? Like, kind of what does that breakdown look like?
It's a pretty mixed bag. There are a couple of really large police agencies that have not participated.
I'm
But
surprised at that, just because of the attention some of the issues have had in Vermont, where there's been an officer mental health patient interaction that's
Yep.
never gone well,
Yeah.
just because of the publicity for it.
Well, the thing about it is, I am so impressed with some of the small agencies that have sent people, because it is a pretty big hardship for them. You think about so many of our small towns have police agencies, and for them to send one person to an all-day
Right.
training,
Sure.
then it's like, who's minding the store, back
Right.
home. So there's one, and I got to say, Randolph Police, very small agency, they've sent every single one of their officers. They only have about
Great.
7, and all
Wow.
of them have been through it.
So is there different, I don't know, Chief, is there different levels of training? When you said, the 100 level and the 200 level, what's the difference in the trainings? Does the 200 level, the Team 2, focus on nuances a little bit? Because I would think in mental health, there's not one size fits all. Everybody who's dealing with a mental health issue is different. And so how do you know in that first few minutes of contact me, what's the difference in the training?
Well, the most significant difference with Team 2 is it's not just law enforcement. It's actually the first time in a regulated training environment
Right.
that we're there, hopefully 50-50, with the crisis workers, the mental health professionals
Great.
in the field. Back to what Kristen was saying earlier, Mary Moulton's big push when she was interim commissioner of mental health was, how do we get mobile crisis really engaged statewide
Right.
to get that. So with Team 2, it's a tabletop essentially, but scenario-based training where you're resolving these issues. What role, you're clarifying issues, what role is the crisis worker participating in, and what are their obligations and responsibilities, and how do they work with law enforcement? And I'll tell you, when we were first doing the original trainers around the state, again, thinking back to my own experience in Montpelier working with Washington County Mental Health, it amazed me to hear from law enforcement officers that they didn't know who their counterpart would be in the mental
Right.
health field, and how I just can't imagine operating that way. But
Right.
But it really demonstrated the need and why this model is so effective. So again, what makes Team 2 so different from Act 80? Act 80 is just for law enforcement and dispatchers now. But it's working the problems
Right.
together, because again, one of the things that I'm frustrated with as a police chief, too often law enforcement seems to own too much of these challenges. And 'cause again, we're really there for a certain aspect of the legal responsibility and for public safety. But beyond that, we can't, maybe, and we try to provide, transportation maybe but if we can go to where someone's in crisis and bring in our counterpart on the mental health
Right.
side, and if we work together and learn together through Team 2, then we've got the best of both worlds. Because as soon as things are safe, like my job as a police officer, I can take a step back and let the mental health professional
Yeah.
really engage with that person.
I'm sure the mental health professional must feel almost relieved when he or she gets on a scene and sees an officer that he knows from training, that there's no worry
Absolutely.
about what the reaction is going to be, because you're all starting on the same plane,
Yeah,
which is
and there's nothing like building those relationships,
Right,
which
I
is
would
what the
think they're
training really
thrilled.
also does for people, is rather than for the first time in a crisis to be meeting each other, they may have already met through training.
So I was looking at some of the training that they talk about, and I said before, mental health, I think, is so different. For how does it teach you to recognize in the first, what do you have, 5 seconds, a minute, to understand where the person's at that you're dealing with? I mean, how do they teach you? Does that
Well, starting with the Act 80, the most important thing that law enforcement can do is, first of all, when we roll up on something, take all the information that we can, try to size up what do we have, what are the absolute emergency needs if they are present, what do we
Right.
need to do to make sure there's public safety. The big push now, and we're doing it with scenario-based training as well as through the Act 80 as well as in Team 2, is how do we slow it down?
Oh,
So you talk about, so it might, because sometimes even just showing up in uniform
Will
can
escalate it.
can escalate, exactly. So how do we start to de-escalate that? How do
Right.
we have that one point of contact, even if there's 3 officers or troopers there? How does that one person just take point and try to engage and start the dialogue and start calming the situation down?
Right.
Those are all vital skill sets that are covered in Act 80, but you have to have those to be successful with Team 2.
Right.
I think it's interesting actually that you're talking about one point of contact. It's kind of a similar concept to first aid, right? The first person on the scene is the point of contact. They're responsible for that
Yes.
person until someone of equal or greater training, comes in and relieves them, right? They're the point person. It's an interesting way of looking at it. And what would a scenario, or just a couple possible scenarios, look like for a mental health situation? Do you try to screen ahead of time for the dispatchers to see if they think there might be a mental health issue involved, and also when you dispatch officers, dispatch like a Team 2 partner, or how does that work typically?
I know for us in Montpelier, and this is one of the challenges we'll get to with Team 2 because it's not the same in terms of resources statewide. But obviously we want to get as much information as we can. Sometimes the very nature of the call, somebody will say, this person's not in their right mind, or something, what are they doing that's so different? Sometimes people will call the police just because someone's behaviors are just out of the social norm. They might be in crisis, they might not be, but we would still respond to that. We'd also look at, do we have a history of this person that we need to communicate that ahead of time to the officers or responding personnel, that anything. So we try to get as much information as we can before we get on scene. And then once we get on scene, especially we're fortunate in a small community like Montpelier, we may know the person already, and we might
Right,
know
they might be
who has
known
the
to
best
you.
rapport on that shift.
Right.
It's like, wow, I had a really bad interaction the last time I tried to help this person, but I know officer, the other officer has a really good rapport. That person, regardless of rank, I'm going to want that person to
Sure.
initiate that conversation and start that process of, how can we help? How can we slow things down? And if need be, how do we bring in, and if there's time, because again, we're going to get there generally before our mental health, counterpart with Washington County even.
Right.
But it's so interesting that you brought up whether it comes from dispatch or not, because
Right.
after the first year of Team 2 training, what we learned was that we really needed to have dispatchers in the room as well.
I would think so.
So they're
That's
now-
kind of
Sure.
yeah. I was thinking through, like, if you have a dispatcher who's able to possibly identify a problem just from the description of the situation, you're already a step ahead of having to dispatch an officer, figuring out what's going on, and then waiting for for another mental health professional to show up. At least you can, even if they can't respond as quickly, at least they're on their way.
But they're so critical to that communication piece.
Right.
So after the first year of Team 2 was only funded by the Department of Mental Health. So once we realized we need to have dispatchers here too, and how can we do that? We had very limited funding. We went to the Department of Public Safety and asked them to contribute. So now it's a truly collaborative
That's
grant that teaches collaboration, which is kind of cool.
Are the dispatchers able or trained to maybe help diffuse the situation depending on who's on the other end of the phone, or to give them guidance of what to do if the person's really out of control or something? So
Absolutely, they're
Yeah.
trained, and that's why before there was Team 2, we prided ourselves in Montpelier. We were, I think, one of the first departments to actually send our dispatchers to the Act 80 training, because you think about who is that first point of
Sure.
contact, or for if the police department and the dispatch, they might be the first point of contact for a walk-in, not just the
Right.
phone. So somebody might be
Right.
suicidal and they're at the
Right.
window, and
Yeah.
there might be all the officers on the road. So what they do in those critical few seconds to minutes can really make or
Yeah.
break too.
I don't
how
think we
it's
give them the credit they're due. I don't think we
Oh,
do.
yeah.
We don't talk about the dispatchers, and they're really part of the team.
Yeah, I
really
mean,
are.
I've worked some cases where, from a negotiation standpoint, where the dispatchers were just unbelievable.
Right.
They were truly, had they not handled a call the way
Right.
they did, could have a very different outcome for the law enforcement later on.
Now, do you have a debriefing every time a situation happens? Because I'm sure this is a very fluid criteria, I mean curriculum, what's the right word? Curriculum, because everything's different, so you must be able to adjust training. I read somewhere, somebody was talking about the Team 2 training, and they said there's nothing like the real life experience, when you're face to face, that you hope you've got the training to help you to respond. So you must do a lot of debriefing to make adjustments as you're going along.
In the training?
In the training,
Yeah.
if
So
you've
in
had
the-
a situation like you talked about before at the church, you must talk about it and say, maybe we should have done this better or that better, and put it in the curriculum.
So as Tony said, the training itself has 3 different scenarios in that one-day training, and every year those scenarios change a little bit.
Yeah,
We have a steering committee that's comprised of representatives from many different agencies in Vermont, as well as a person with lived experience. Different law enforcement entities are represented on the steering committee, as well as mental health agencies. And they really decide what the curriculum is going to be. I have a group of about 38 trainers around the state.
Right.
And every year, at the end of the grant cycle, I'll put out to them, what's the hot topic in your particular region? And people will give me ideas for scenarios, and that's how those change.
That's great, yeah.
So, for example, 2 years ago, there was a real increase in calls with people on the autism spectrum. So we made sure to have a scenario that involved somebody on the autism spectrum. And they're purposefully written so that they have terminology in them that may be unfamiliar to either mental health workers or to law enforcement, so that they each can learn
great.
a common language. So just for example, I just remember in the scenario with the individual with autism, I included some information about there was a weighted blanket in the room, for example. And
for
that allows
comfort.
for people to ask, like, well, what is that? And
Right.
that's one way for them to learn.
Great.
There's another really common call where you might be familiar with called a welfare check.
Yep.
And one of our scenarios last year involved a woman out of state, worried about her elderly mother, couldn't reach her in Vermont, so she'd called and asked the local PD to do a welfare check. And when the police arrived in the scenario, what the participants are reading is that the woman appears to be in an altered state. And so that starts a discussion about, well, what's an
that?
altered state? It could be, is it some kind of alcohol problem? Or is it a medical problem, like a
Right.
urinary tract infection? Or is it some kind of psychosis? So that's another way for law enforcement to learn, well, who knew that urinary tract infections can sometimes look like
I was just going to
psychosis?
ask that, and I thought, well,
Yeah.
what's the answer to
Yeah,
that
yeah.
question
I mean,
on
it's-
TV?
So the scenarios are very, very purposeful. They're based on
That's great.
real cases that have happened. And we try to always include one scenario that has a child involved.
Right.
Try to include one scenario that has a veteran or some kind of combination of either a substance abuse problem or an alcohol problem.
Or do you do
Really, and we
PTSD,
can
you
keep
must.
adding to them as we
Yeah.
we can go off script, in the training to sort of pose questions. What would you do if this was a non-English speaking person, for example?
Right.
So it really doing those scenarios really allows people to.
It sadly
get
sounds like
comfortable.
we have a few scenarios every year, don't we?
Yeah.
We do.
Yeah.
You were talking about numbers, that there's a report that talks about numbers of incidents, but is this something that happens, I'm going to use the word frequently, but where we have an interaction with a mental health patient?
It's extremely frequent. I think Burlington, a couple of years, Burlington PD had some really important statistics when Chief Sherling was still there,
Right.
as far as, I want to say it was almost 400% increase over a certain period of time of the increase in those numbers of calls. One of the challenges that we have, even in terms of looking at the efficacy of the Act 80 training or even Team 2, just how many of these interactions were micro-interactions, because one of the things that that challenges us in law enforcement is that unless the situation justified an incident or responding to a call, sometimes just having the officers on foot patrol or just talking to somebody that we know generally has some mental health issues.
Right.
Is that a statistic, or is that just checking on somebody in your community? And the other thing is the awareness that happens with the Act 80 training in terms of truly how prevalent it is for that so many people have or are affected by mental illness.
Right.
That's because it's and it's just because you have an incident or you're in crisis does not mean it's a long-term situation.
Right.
There's a lot of factors that drive people to whether they're just challenged. It could be overly tired, diet, all these things. But again, but sometimes we might go to a call that had nothing to do with somebody that was experiencing a crisis, but they might be present. And our ability to communicate with that person, even as a victim of a crime, that's not a mental health call, but our ability to effectively engage that person because of the training and the support and the teamwork of both of these trainings is vital to our success. So it's hard to qualify and quantify sometimes these numbers.
I guess I'm just so curious about how long, I'm worried about the timing. When you have somebody that's in crisis and you're trying to calm the situation down, we're just talking minutes, or does it go on?
Some of these
But,
challenges can last hours.
Oh, really?
And hours.
Oh.
And again, that's where you always have that balancing point of that's where you bring in a negotiating team. That's why we
Right.
work very closely with Vermont State Police. And we very recently did a training with their tactical and crisis negotiating unit here in Montpelier. Is that is the situation getting better, or is it getting worse to where lives are at stake? And again, ideally we want to slow it down until we can get that person to be acceptance of
Right.
getting that help.
Right.
That is one of the big messages during the training is, this is not going to be hurry up and let's get out of here.
Right.
It's going to be necessary to really step back and sort of assess the situation and see what's going on. But one of the things we hope that people can do is working together with their mental health counterpart, that once it's figured out that it's a secure scene, that it's safe, and if law enforcement can leave, that they can hand it
Oh,
off
just
because
have
they've
the
got to
mental
go on
health
to
people
another
there.
call.
Oh, good.
Yeah. And I think both sides have figured out that it really works a lot better if they can be there together. And each, both mental health crisis workers, they learn a lot about the limits of law enforcement's job,
Yeah.
as well as law enforcement learning in the training the limits of what the mental health crisis worker
Right.
can do.
And I think you're right. I bet if the person knows the mental health people, that's got to go a long way to diffusing the
Absolutely.
situation.
Well, helping to
Everything.
build that relationship.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there was the Grennan Group. Is that how you pronounce it? Grennan Group, which Jim Leddy, Senator Leddy, was very instrumental in putting. I don't know if you've worked with that group out of Burlington, because they've done a lot of work in the legislature.
I have worked with them.
Have you? Yeah. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that situation and what former Senator Leddy did.
Well, so the Grennan Group is what they're calling themselves now.
Right.
That formed out of the concern and the aftermath of the shooting of Phil Grennan, who
Right.
was actually a childhood friend of Jim Leddy's.
Oh.
And that happened up in Burlington just a little bit over a year ago.
Yeah.
And so Jim took it upon himself to try to find out about what kind of training police have. He didn't have any idea. And he got together a few people, including retired Judge Michael Coopersmith,
Right.
Cindy Taylor Patch, who I mentioned earlier, who
Yep.
is in charge of training at the Vermont Police Academy. Some other folks from or with mental health backgrounds. Psychiatrist Richard Bernstein, who's retired psychiatrist, and who's also an EMT. And they started meeting, and the only way I got involved was they asked me to come and teach them, tell them about Team 2.
Right.
But out of that group came sort of 3 big initiatives that they wanted to try to make something positive come out of that, real tragic incident. One of those was to look at police training and to see, make sure that people were being able to access it. And one of the questions they looked at was whether or not Team 2 should also be a mandatory training for law enforcement officers. So we spent some time talking about that. But the big thing that they also looked at resources, meaning financial resources
Right.
for mental health agencies to be able to, in fact, be mobile, because that's one of the issues in some parts of the state right now. For some of the mental health agencies, they're not able to keep staff because of their very low pay.
Right. Yeah,
frankly.
Mary was talking a lot about
Yeah.
that on the show, that they just can't keep them because
Yeah.
they make more money going to state government
They
or
do.
somewhere else.
Yeah, so that was another thing the Grennan Group was looking at, was resources. And then the third thing was to create a mental health review commission that's sort of loosely based on the Domestic Violence Fatality Review Commission that's currently in place
Right.
and that's mandated by statute. So there is a bill right now, House 145, which has just been voted out of committee and has moved over to the Senate side. Establishing a mental health oversight commission. So this would be a group of about, I want to say 10 to 12 people, I think.
Yeah.
A real mixture of law enforcement and stakeholders, both family members, people with lived experience, people with mental health expertise, that would look at any incident that involved law enforcement that involves substantial bodily injury and or death. Those would be have to be reported to the commission, and then what would optionally be reported is are really good good outcomes,
Yeah, where it
things work
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
That's a
What
good
can we
So-
replicate?
It's really an idea
Yeah, more of
not
those.
to question how people acted sort of in the scenario or in the situation, but rather look at a systems overview to see, like, is there anything that we could have been doing
Right.
that would have prevented this from happening?
So I'm sure we're all human. We all come with some kind of stereotypes, and I'm sure this training is perfect, because you've got to get over that, not that one size fits all, or just the term mental health means X,
Yeah.
and how you deal with it. It's got to be very difficult, I think. So
Well, that's
it's
one of
good
the
you're
reasons.
training.
One of the reasons that we require the completion of Act 80 before,
because
we
that sets
want-
the baseline.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And
Is that the bill you were talking about, Chief, at lunch today, 145, or is
Yes.
that? So you've been up to testify, have you not, on that?
Yes,
both of you?
most of it. I testified the same day that Chris, you testified, and Cindy Taylor Patch.
Yeah.
The Attorney General also is very supportive of this type of initiative.
Well, and Jim Leddy is certainly a good person to shepherd that through the legislature,
So,
because he's certainly well known and respected.
but we all want to have make sure that we're doing everything we possibly can in the state
Right.
to protect our most vulnerable population.
Yeah,
So.
because I remember you and I and the chief from Barry, quite a few of us from this area years ago worked with Mary about mental health issues up at the hospital, in the emergency room, and we were working on where they should go, and I thought the relationship in Washington County, as you mentioned before, has always been excellent.
Really.
And I
It
think
has.
that really
And I hate to say it,
kudos
but I had
you
taken
and-
it for
Yeah.
granted for many, many decades, just about until Team 2, when I saw some of the challenges in other parts of the state.
Yeah.
You know,
But
where-
you're right, that's a real tribute to the chief.
No, I was really between the chief and I think Chief Bombardier and Barry, you two have a great relationship, and Mary, of course, is right there to help.
She's the glue that
Oh,
holds it
I
all
just,
together.
I love her. I just love her so. I'm a
Yeah.
real fan.
Well, it makes so much sense because, you know, police officers and law enforcement oftentimes they're on the front line, and they're the ones getting the calls and interacting with these people who are going through mental health crisis, and, you know, having the resources for them to deal with a situation like that, because you never know what you're walking into, right?
Well, there's been, you know, one of the things that we've also learned over the years from our mental health counterparts, there's been scenarios or situations where law enforcement is not there yet, and all of a sudden law enforcement shows up, and okay, here's the shotgun that the person had that was in crisis. You know,
Right.
so
Oh.
that just shows the need for having
Right.
that joint response. Again,
Right.
law enforcement being there for the safety piece.
So I read there was a report that was on the internet, and they were talking about the steering committee, and that they thought maybe a recommendation to include even more people in the training, whether it be emergency department people, because I would think the more people that could possibly be involved should be involved.
Well, that is something that the steering committee has talked about every
Right.
year, at the end of the year.
Who else?
Because I always ask the participants, you know, who else would you like to see? Who do you think needs to be
Right,
at the table?
EMTs, and there's
Right.
probably a laundry list of
So we
folks.
came up, EMTs, I think, are the next sort of targeted group. We wanted to really make sure that we had covered law enforcement and mental health crisis clinicians, you know,
Right,
getting that really important collaborative piece down.
that's great.
As well as dispatchers. We've added developmental service providers
Oh.
because a lot of mental health agencies have a separate team of people who can respond if it's an intellectual disability, which is it's a whole different ball of wax than from a mental health crisis. So,
Okay, could you explain that a little bit to my
to the
dense-
best way that I
dense
can.
mind who's not getting that?
Because I've learned a
I'll
lot as
admit
well.
it if I'm off base here. But
So that would be somebody with a low IQ, maybe, or
Oh, I
with
see.
a traumatic brain injury,
Right.
or just an intellectual disability, cognitive impairment, as
Right.
opposed to having schizophrenia, for
I see.
example.
Okay, thank you. I
Some-
figure if I have the question, they might too. So I don't-
So that would be something like someone's not able to understand the instructions that a police officer
Exactly,
is giving them. Is that kind of
exactly. Yeah.
what we're talking about?
But that's, so mental health agencies, some of them have separate teams who would,
Oh,
who
not
would be able
together.
to come out and provide support to law enforcement in
Right.
how to handle this particular situation. Not, some agencies, it's the same team, but
Right.
most have a separate response team. And some even have, as you might know, the Howard Center, for example, have a whole separate team for kids. You know,
Oh,
they've
right.
now all integrated into one big team, but they have, you know, depending on the situation.
That must be so complicated if there's first of all, the age of a child doesn't have the maturity, and then on top of that, having a mental health issue, that must really be a challenge because you're dealing with a kid. And
Well, it's a challenge, I think, for the crisis worker to tease out, are we just looking at bad behavior, or are we
Right,
looking at an
right.
actual disability?
Disability.
So it's really important that they're there to help law enforcement, because we can't expect law enforcement to be our, you know, mental health experts.
right. And do you work, you mentioned before the negotiators from public safety.
Yes.
I mean, that when they're on scene, you have to be really right there to help them along with what you know of the situation. And they must be trained in this as well, right? The negotiators?
Yes, and then they have advanced training, and it's really they work, you know, as for example in Montpelier, if I were to call in, you know, I need specialized resources, which we have done in the past. They kind of show up as a package, so they make sure that they have whatever tactical resources might need to be there to keep people safe. And also,
Right.
sometimes that's also required so they can be close to a situation to effectively have dialogue and start that or continue that de-escalation and you know, problem solving.
Yeah.
So Tony says yes, but my answer is no. They're not part of the Team 2 training yet.
Oh.
But that
Oh,
is
I-
another
But it-
group.
yeah,
Okay, I
but-
see.
That is
but,
another
Okay.
group
But
that
it
we've
they
talked
should
about
be.
trying to how to integrate them into
Right.
the
Yeah,
training.
because they
as well.
should know what you know, and you should both be on the, all be
Well,
on the
it-
same team, not, I mean, about how to approach something too, because,
And so often, a mental health crisis will result in the crisis negotiation unit or CNU having to come out and start that negotiation,
Right.
with like a barricaded subject, for example. And so it's sort of being able to train together with mental health, like
Yeah, I would
when
think
is that
that's
handoff
important.
going to happen? What
so
if the
is that a
person
next
asks?
step for Team 2, where's, what's,
Right,
what's-
we're exploring it.
Are you?
Yeah, we're
Really?
starting to explore it. Also, emergency department personnel, another
Oh, well, we
key
had the
communication.
bill we were working on, I don't remember all the details, but we worked on it a long time, about for emergency personnel when people are brought in, mostly with alcoholism, but then when they sort of wake up and they don't know where they are and they're dealing with mental health issues, and it becomes very, a real problem for the emergency room
Yeah.
personnel to, and then they call in law enforcement, so.
Yeah. And what
um,
ends up sometimes happening is if people aren't, don't have those relationships again,
Right.
there may be some little bit of friction about, well, who's in charge here? This patient's in cuffs because me as a law enforcement officer brought them in handcuffs,
Right.
and the emergency department wants me to take them off, but I'm concerned about their safety. So, I mean, it can be a real
So
sort of
that's,
give and
how do
take.
you handle that? Because on a normal, if there's a person without mental health disabilities, I'm sure you're the person in charge of a situation, correct? But if it's a mental health person, who is in charge?
Well, that's where relationships, and that
Yeah,
goes to the
the
foundation
team.
of Team 2,
Team 2,
exactly, because
right.
there is a time and a place where if it's something that is dangerous, as Kristen said, like a barricaded subject, that is ultimately my responsibility.
Right.
I've been on scenes where the tactical team was warming up because we weren't sure how I was going to go with the negotiators, and I wasn't getting anywhere with this person after quite some time talking to a door. I remember trying but it felt good to have a crisis worker from Washington County Mental Health right around, just in a safe location. I said, this isn't working. I'm going to plan A's not working. I'm going to try plan B. Try to introduce that person. It got worse. Okay, but it's trust in relationships,
Right.
and that equals back to your earlier question about even debriefing and right after a situation.
Right.
That's how we're going to get stronger as a team, and I just can't stress that enough. Is that over time, like there's some people at Washington County Mental Health. It's like they've been in a patrol car with me all these years.
Wow.
Because Gary Gordon, for example,
Yeah,
who was
well, he
on
was
our
on our
steering,
show. I was
he's
so
on the
impressed
steering
with him.
team.
Yeah.
And it's that kind of relationship that, boy, I wish that could be replicated throughout the state.
Right.
And that's kind of the goal, I think, in the work that Kristen's been doing
Yeah.
with Team 2.
Gary was very impressive, wasn't he?
Yeah, he's talking about his team and what they do and how they work with your department and other departments, and it's very
24/7.
impressive.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
You know?
He's available.
Yeah, wow.
That's the thing. That's what the police say. They wish they could have, 7 Gary Gordons.
I could see that. I've met him before, but never had the chance to really talk to him. He was very
So
impressive.
he's on the steering committee. He was one of the
Oh,
original
really?
members, along
Yeah.
with Tony, to help shape the curriculum.
Now, are there people on your committee that have had mental health problems before? Because the one thing, and you remember the woman's name, she was wonderful,
Is that my phone?
on the
Sarah.
board of directors of
Yeah,
Washington
Sarah Hall.
County. And Ann Donahue makes no secret about the
Yeah.
fact that she has been in the system, and now she's a real advocate.
Mm-hmm.
And she adds an incredible amount of information to discussions.
She sure does.
I mean, she's one of
And
the
she-
only legislators who reads every single bill, may I say. And she's just so wonderful to talk to.
Yeah.
And she knows. She lived it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think the same with is it Sarah? My mind is.
Yes, it
Yeah,
is Sarah.
Well, and I'm sure she's helped the board too to bring
She
real
has.
life situations and make them real.
Yeah. So in the original steering committee, we had family members of people with lived
Oh, okay.
experience. And now we just realized we have that gap again where we don't have that
Don't have-
representation. So now we do. We have a woman who has volunteered to come in and speak at the training, because a big component of every Team 2 training is a panel of people that speak to the participants about their own experiences, and
Right.
it always includes somebody with lived experience.
Because I was
from
thinking
that region.
how they view the scene in front of them with all the police and the mental
Right.
health and the
Well-
lights and whatever else is out there. I know how I'd react, so I
So-
can't imagine if I'm struggling mentally.
Well, what's really helpful, I think, for everybody is the people that we get or who volunteer to come in and speak are people who have had some interaction in the past with law enforcement, whether it's positive or negative. And they can tell the police, what it felt like for them. So here we are in training, and they can hear, and I'll just give you an example where this one woman came in and told them, she talks about how she's been arrested many, many times. She's been to the state hospital many times. And one time in particular, she remembers sitting in the back of the patrol car, and the two officers were in the front seat talking about her as if she wasn't there. Talking about her, like saying,
like, hello.
very negative. And she's
Right.
like, look, I'm here.
Right.
I can hear what you're saying.
Right,
Yes, I'm mentally ill, but I'm not deaf.
right,
And she does it in a very humorous way, but it also just reminds everybody,
Yep.
you know what?
they are real people.
They're real people.
Right.
You got to treat them with respect and dignity.
Yeah.
And
Well, you wouldn't talk about someone who had a broken leg, saying like,
Right.
oh, they're, they can't walk or whatever.
Right.
You wouldn't sit in front of someone and say something like that. And it's the same thing
Yeah.
with mental health.
With
You
some
have to
respect.
recognize it's
Yeah.
a health issue, and we got to treat it like
but
that.
Sometimes-
getting to hear about it from somebody
Yeah.
who's been through it is just
Right.
so powerful,
Right.
so much more
When
meaningful.
when you've calmed the situation down, are there services available where you can bring these people? I mean, who makes the decision of where they should go after? I mean, because we've talked a lot. I mean, the hospital in Berlin, and there's.
Depends on where
It
they're
doesn't
at.
sound like we have the services necessary out there. Maybe.
It depends on where they're at the when we think it's resolved or stable.
Right.
In many cases, they will voluntarily say, "Look, can you just come up to the ER?" Other times, we might put a plan in place right where they live, so
Right.
they're not just relocated
Right.
temporarily, and they're it's a stable, safe. They're in a good place.
Because we've heard horror stories, sort of, about lack of beds and how long people have to stay
Absolutely.
in the hospital to get a bed. I mean, it's a real crisis. I use that
Around
word
the
with-
state.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's really
Yeah.
bad. So I'm wondering, here you go through all the effort and successfully diffuse the situation, and it could flare up again if you put the person in the wrong place without the right support. But have you run into that, or it seems to work out okay?
It's rare for us here right in Washington County, but
Right.
it does happen.
Yeah.
There's times still where people are waiting for a bed once they're in basically in the care of the Department of Mental Health.
Right.
When they're waiting for transportation, there certainly are a lot of challenges, and
Yeah.
and those are the kinds of issues that I'm hoping something like a review commission will have
Yeah.
to really identify: is there a pattern, or is there
Right.
where are we as a system, as a state of as a government, both local and state,
Right.
where are these gaps, and how we're
Good.
because again the analogy that's been used repetitively, if somebody has a cardiac event,
Mm-hmm.
boom, you know what's going to happen regardless of where you live in Vermont.
Right.
But if you have a mental health situation, a crisis, who knows
Right.
what is going to be that course of care, and how is that going to be
Well,
delivered?
Ann was on my show last year, and she brought up the issue of parity. May not be quite for this discussion, but when you look at the legislature, mental health is in a different committee than health care. And
Yeah.
when
Used
she
to be.
said that, a light went on. I thought, what are we doing?
Right.
It is part of health care, and should be part, not separate.
And this year it
And-
is. I mean,
Huh?
this year it's part of in the house.
Yes,
health.
It is
and I
out
think
there,
they
yeah.
really are dealing with the parity issue, and
Yeah.
I'm hoping this H-145, is it getting the attention it needs and moving along?
I think it's
I
been
believe
strongly
so. Yeah.
supported.
I mean, all law enforcement supported it.
Great.
It really hasn't had any opposition yet.
Because
yet.
there's more money needs to be put into mental health, because, and you have to set priorities, and I'm glad I'm not there making those priorities, because it's very difficult, but it seems to me the number of mental health people is increasing, and every time there's a big issue, somehow there's a mental health component. And I think I'm glad they're looking at it in the legislature.
What we really don't want to have happen is for a real tragedy to happen, and
Right,
that
and
be
then
the reason that
the
we
light
then
goes on.
put
Right.
Yeah.
resources.
Yeah, there's been enough tragedies in this area that we should be able to start hopefully addressing the system.
Right.
Yeah.
There's this bill in the Senate, I believe, that puts $30 million into funding. I don't think we've talked about it yet, but is that something you think is going to benefit Team 2 and this partnership between mental health professionals
Well,
and law enforcement?
it's definitely going to benefit the response that we're able to give for people in a mental health crisis, because as I alluded to earlier, there are some pockets of the state where they just don't have the workers available to go out. So
Right.
if the police call and say, hey, I'm at a scene, can you come join me, help me out here? And they have to say no because they don't have the personnel. So that's where that $30 million bill is going to help them out.
One of the staggering things that Mary Moulton had shared when they were on the show a couple weeks ago from Washington County Mental Health is that they have 150 people on staff and they have 90 open positions.
Yes.
Which
Yeah,
is
they can't fill
staggering.
them because people are leaving, or they're
Yep.
not
Yes.
saying no to the position because of the pay,
Yes,
and they're needed.
they are
And
needed.
the academic qualifications and
Right,
experience to
right.
be effective in those
Yeah.
Right,
positions.
exactly.
Yeah.
That's
And
not
what
something I
we're
don't think
asking
they
them to
can-
do.
On-the-job training is not a,
Yeah.
Right.
you need experience.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and we're
So-
asking them to really, put themselves out there 24 hours a day
Yeah.
as well.
So you must work with all of the mental health associations around the state,
I do.
like Mary's
Yeah.
group. Are they all pretty much on the same plane, and they're all very much supportive of this, I'm sure?
They're all very supportive of Team 2,
Yeah.
absolutely. And there are trainers from each of those designated mental health
Great.
agencies on my team.
Great.
So there's 5 different regions of the state where we put on the trainings.
Right.
The grant calls for there to be 8 trainings a year. So not everybody gets 2 trainings a year. That was our initial thought, was it would be good if we could do it every 6 months. But there are some areas where, like Washington County, for example, they don't really need it twice a year because they already are practicing collaboration all the time. So they get it
That's our
about
Mary.
once every year and a half or so.
Yeah.
Down in the southwest region, the areas, so that covers Bennington, Rutland, and Addison counties. So those trainings are staggered between Bennington, Rutland, and Middlebury.
Yeah.
So, but every single mental health agency is very much, has been very supportive of Team 2. They're, not only do they provide trainers, but the grant doesn't quite cover all of the expenses. We offer, one way to get police officers to come to a training is to offer free food.
Oh, there you
So,
go.
free
Oh,
lunch,
that
right?
is true.
Free
Huh?
lunch will show up.
Feed them, they'll come.
So the grant doesn't cover it entirely. So the designated agencies, that's their contribution, is they pay for half the lunch, as well as there's always coffee and pastry, donuts,
Donuts.
in the morning.
Stereotype. Good
I know.
grief.
The state police they also provide me with an office space, so I can
nice.
split my time between the cubicle in Washington County Mental Health
Right.
and a desk in the Royalton Barracks.
Oh, nice.
The state police also provide all of the paper materials, so the binders and the things that go in name tags, stuff
Yeah,
that goes into
good.
training, they provide that.
Well, I saw on the internet the copy of the Good News, which is
Oh, good, yeah.
And I don't know if I thought was that the first one?
It's the
there's-
first one.
Well,
It was in
was
this year's
excellent.
grant. Oh,
It was
good.
excellent. I printed
I'm
it
glad
out
you
and
liked
read
it.
all the stories.
Oh, good.
I bet it's going to be well received because
It has been well received.
I bet because people were really sharing
Yeah,
what the
yeah.
experiences were. Which
So
and I was
that's-
surprised there were so many stories, which
Yeah.
is
Well, that's just
Sad.
the tip of the iceberg,
Oh,
really. I mean, the way that came about is that in this year's grant, we said, all we hear are negative things about how police interact with
well,
and we
that's
need
why I
to get
wanted
the
you
word
to come
out
on because
about all
you know
those
I
good
support
things.
police. So
So that's written into the grant was that I needed to publish that
Right.
one time.
well, it
I
was
think
an
it'll
excellent.
be. I hope that it will be
Yeah.
ongoing.
I must have gotten it off of the Team 2 website. Is that where it was?
We don't have a website.
No, I wonder where I got that.
But I think I sent it to you.
Oh, did you?
I
Well,
did,
there you
yeah.
go. Because it is excellent, and
Good.
if I would like the link, and I'll put it on the end of the show.
Okay.
Because I think people should really read that, because it's stories of what really,
Yeah.
it's not out of the classroom, it's the real thing,
Yeah.
and was excellent.
And I think to me, so what I did for that was I asked all the trainers to give me, they knew I had to do this, I asked them for stories. So some of those came from the crisis workers and some came from law enforcement. And it just so, I mean, some of them just demonstrate the incredible success when
Right,
you work
right.
together to solve a problem.
Right.
So that was, it was really, it felt really important to me, but there could have been probably at least 10 other stories in
Wow.
there.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you deal a lot with suicides? Is that something that you go out and deal with a lot? Or I was just thinking, for some reason, something we said reminded me of teen suicides, and we have a very high rate here in Vermont, per capita high rate. Is that anything you all have been?
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's certainly
involved?
part of it when someone's in crisis.
Yeah.
One of the things we want to be really clear. First of all, if we can at least talk to them and they don't have a firearm in there or something
Right.
so immediate, but do they want to hurt themselves?
Right.
Be very direct about that. And the other piece of Team 2 training is that at the end, we sit down and we come up with every resource that we can think of that's in their jurisdiction.
Right.
So, and that's where that's important. So again, as Kristen said earlier, if the scenario involved a veteran, we have to have a relationship with the VA
Right.
and some of those
Right.
resources, or even a police officer in crisis. And so it's again knowing, having at least a backdrop of who can I call to assist me to assist this person. But certainly everything that we do is all about protecting that sanctity of human life. Are we working together to make sure we're doing everything we can to save that life, just as that emergency medical technician or that paramedic,
Right.
that ER doc, to make sure that again the de-escalation, everything that we're doing, both for just law enforcement or as a mental health crisis worker, it's just saving that life.
And
So-
that's also to me,
No,
to me why it's important to have the trainings occur regionally,
Right.
because the resources are different depending on what part of the state you're in.
Oh,
And one of
right,
the
that makes
things
sense.
that comes up is that I didn't think about until I started doing this was cell phone coverage.
Oh,
So
yes,
when
we
we do
learned that in
I
Irene,
can tell you,
didn't we?
when we
Yes.
did when I do the Northwest region, which is South Burlington, we don't talk about cell phone coverage. It's not an issue really up there. But when all the other counties, everybody knows which part of their town or their commute
Right.
where they don't have any coverage.
What
And
window to stand out of,
for,
too,
yeah.
right?
So for a crisis worker who may be
Right,
on the
sure.
way to a call and to not have, or for a law enforcement officer to
Right.
not have cell phone coverage, that's a real, it can be a real safety problem.
Yeah,
Do
exactly.
the crisis workers have radios that they can communicate with law enforcement, or is that not
So
on?
they're out
they're
there
not
by
using
themselves without?
Well, that's where again,
Wow.
if they're out there by themselves, but what we hope that happens through again these relationships is that the crisis worker will call me up and say, "Hey, Tony, I've got this call. It's a welfare check, whatever it may be. I'm going to be way out there." So part of their plan might be, okay, first of all, can you come with me?
Right.
Sure, I can just be outside, if you
Right.
don't, but I'm there if you need me, or again helping them come up with emergency planning. In other words, to make sure that they're safe. Because again, what you don't want to have happen is all of a sudden you get the call afterward, and the crisis worker hands you the shotgun that they just took from a worker.
Yeah, right. Right.
And so that's what's really important in terms of that planning ahead. So they're not just, and sometimes it does happen. Sometimes it could be something that's routine for them, and a situation change, the dynamics change, and they
Right.
need law enforcement.
Right.
So those are, but we try to be really thoughtful as far as how we approach these calls.
Yeah.
Same thing for law enforcement too. If we really think that, we're just going to elevate this the situation where that person's mental, given their mental state, we need maybe to be there, but we really want to have our counterpart from mental health really take
Right.
point, because as soon as again that handoff of getting care, we can't deliver care as law
Right.
enforcement. We're just there to keep people safe, ultimately.
Right.
And that's really, again, that theme that is just hammered on throughout the
That's
training,
right.
even as we work together.
Yeah, the
We have-
safety is really what we emphasize.
Well, I would think for the workers too, they have to.
Absolutely.
That's the one, they
yeah,
have to be safe.
Absolutely.
And I'm sure there's people around always helping.
Each of those scenarios that I talked about,
Yeah.
there are 3 things that we are really sort of drilling down to get the participants to talk about, and that's the safety aspect of it, the clinical aspects, and the legal aspect. So, and just as an aside, the other people who are invited to come to the training but often don't come are the state's attorneys in each region. And it's so, when they do come, it's so helpful to have their voice to talk about
Now,
the
you would
legal
think they would
aspects.
come, because if you do their end of the work
Right.
correctly up front, it's got to save them a whole
You'd
lot
think
of
that,
headaches.
you'd
Yes,
think that,
that's what
yeah.
I think.
Yeah, yeah.
Shame on them.
Well-
They really should be there, because
Yeah.
it would help you to do
Absolutely.
it right.
Absolutely.
Because what's common sense may not be right in their world on the law. So we have about 2 minutes left, and if there's something that we haven't touched, I found this fascinating. I'll leave it up to you to fill in the 2 minutes.
I think one thing that's important for people to know is this is a year-to-year grant. So it's not, there's sort of, it feels a little bit, while there's a lot of support for it,
Right.
it's still, you know, I'm always kind of gritting my teeth and saying, are we going to be able to do this again next
Right.
year?
Well, I hope
But
so.
we've really enjoyed the support of the Department of Public Safety collaborating with Department of Mental Health, and hopefully that will continue.
Is this
That's great.
a general fund grant, or is there a special, there's no special revenue?
It's from
Stream.
Department of Mental Health.
Department of Mental Health.
And Department of Public Safety.
Right.
Okay.
So,
So-
it's off of their general fund dollars. So.
It is.
Yeah.
So we're in fact meeting with the new commissioner next week
Right.
to make sure that he's
This
aware
is not a
of the
good year
importance
for
of it.
more,
Right.
or
So
you
am
just
I-
hope
and-
level funded, I guess.
Right.
And it is a relatively inexpensive training. I mean, my position is half-time, and other than the cost of the officer's time, you know,
Right.
it's free for law enforcement to come, it's free for everybody to come to.
I
but it-
think that's money well spent for the officers, because
Yeah.
Well, this is absolutely one of the core pillars of community policing in the
Right.
21st century, is
Totally.
making sure that we're well engaged, we're well trained, and we're, again, we're equipped as a team to help every member of our community.
And these are members of our community, which
Absolutely.
we have to take care of them. Thank you both for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Thank you for having
And thank
us.
you for tuning in. We'll see you next week. And in the meantime, keep listening beyond the soundbite.